celebration on Easter, Easter breakfast, Easter egg hunt, all these flowers, and then everything kind of dies down again, goes back to the status quo. And so I wanted to, for these next 6 weeks, explore what I'm calling resurrection reverberations. And this is, where does the resurrection of Jesus Christ reverberate, happen again among us today? Because that's the point that John actually is making in his gospel. He says to Thomas, who must put his hand in Jesus' side, he says to Thomas, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." That's you and me today. We have not seen the resurrection. We came much later, and yet we believe. And so this book of John was written so that all of us who come after the resurrection may continue to feel the power of that resurrection among us today. And this gospel reading from Job, as I told the kids, Job suffered these terrible afflictions at the hand of God. He was covered with sores. His wife and his children left him. He was left all alone, completely destitute and crying. And yet he says, in the midst of this lament to God, of all these things that have happened to him, how much he is hurting, how sad he is, he's grieving, he's mourning, he's sore. He even says his breath is repulsive to his wife, which is an interesting line in the gospel. But even in the midst of all this pain, of all this agony, Job says this key line right in the middle, verse 25, "I know that my Redeemer lives." You're going to come back every weekend. Yes. I love it. I know that my Redeemer lives. Job says, in the midst of all this turmoil, all this anguish, he knows that his Redeemer lives, and he hasn't even seen the resurrection yet. Job comes before the promise, and yet Job believes in the promise. And I wanted to use this text for us today, the week after Easter, to show that as our lives go on, our lives move on from Easter, even despite that. Even despite maybe in the week after Easter you had a doctor's appointment that didn't go so well. Maybe you had something happen to a family member. Maybe you had to visit someone in the hospital. Maybe something didn't go so well at your job. And life goes on. And trouble happens. And sin happens. And pain happens. Yet even in the midst of that, we all say together, "For I know that my Redeemer lives." And the resurrection continues to reverberate among us even despite great pain. And so I want to talk a little bit about the day after Easter. Because we have this great mountaintop experience together at church. We had Xavier, one of our youth, up here telling us all about, explaining the entire Easter story to us. And what happens the day after Easter? What did you do on Easter morning, or on Easter Monday? I know I was a little bit surprised with how I felt on Easter Monday, because I thought I was waiting, this whole Lent, we had all these extra services, we were working so hard to make sure everything was set, and I think I kind of thought on Easter Monday, I'm going to feel so relaxed, so happy, so relieved, but instead I was surprised that I felt still a little bit restless. That's why I included this picture of this girl, because she looks a little bit restless, right, a little bit uncertain. And that's how I felt on Easter Monday, a little bit restless. That there was still so much work to be done. I didn't feel satisfied as though we'd reached our mountaintop, our climax, this is the best it's ever going to be. No, instead I still felt restless with the work of God that still needed to be done within me and within this place. And I'm wondering what you all did the day after Easter. I know that one member of our congregation had knee replacement surgery the day after Easter. Pretty exciting way to celebrate. What else did we do the day after Easter? Went back to jobs, went back to work. The day after Easter does not always hold within it the same promise, the same hope that Easter did. But that's true of the world that we live in. And so what happened the day after Easter? One thing that happened in my life is that I woke up and I was reading the news, as I always do, and I saw that on Easter, in our city of Chicago, 6 children were shot. And Mayor Rahm Emanuel was quoted as saying, he said, their youth has been taken from them. And so here we are, we have this Easter celebration, this glorious day where we're all triumphant saying, Jesus has risen. And in the face of that joy and that resurrection, 6 children and other witnesses, others who were there with them, had their youth taken from them. And it's almost like we're smacked right back into reality, right? That, oh, Easter is wonderful, and yet violence and sin still happen. And it's not happening halfway across the world, but right here in our own city. And so it was an interesting morning for me. And see, what I was thinking on Monday morning is when I usually kind of start brainstorming and thinking about what I'm going to preach about on Sunday. And I had this plan in mind. And I thought, this Sunday after Easter is going to be such a triumphant, joyous day. And we're going to have this group here with us from Shekinah, and they're going to be bringing us all kinds of music. And we had just celebrated on Palm Sunday 10 new members joining our congregation. And I thought that, this week after Easter is just going to be this triumphant day, and I wanted to preach this sermon series on resurrection, reverberation, and what's all coming up, and how great all this new life is, and all this new life that's happening at Shekinah, all the new life that's happening at St. Philip. And yet, that was my plan, and God took my plan and turned it upside down. Because how can I preach this triumphant, great spirit sermon about all this new life that's happening in our church when children are having their lives and their youth taken from them right here in Chicago on Easter of all days? So what was Easter like in Chicago this year? Where do we find ourselves in the midst of this Holy Week, in the midst of a Good Friday and an Easter Sunday? Where do we find ourselves on this journey? The beginning of one of the articles I read said that at least 9 people were killed and 36 people were wounded since Friday, over Easter weekend. And so I changed it to say since Good Friday. Because the events that happen today, whether it's violence, whether it's illness, whether it's war, whether it's terror, the events that happen to us today happen in the midst of our own Holy Weeks that we walk through. And so just as those women that we read about in our gospel story, just as they waited at the tomb, they waited to see Jesus rise, haven't many of us gathered at our own tombs and grave sites of the ones we love? And I bet in Chicago, the family and the friends of 9 people who were killed gathered together at those grave sites after the funerals. And they waited. And just like the women, they were waiting at the tomb, just like the women, we have waited at the tomb of our loved ones who have died, some of them who have died too soon, who've died before their time. We wait with them at the tomb. We wait knowing in our hearts with Job, covered with sores, covered with pain, covered with sin, covered with violence. We wait at that tomb in agony. And someone among us, perhaps someone like Job, perhaps someone who's waiting at the tomb, whispers, I know that my Redeemer lives. And in the midst of the wait at this tomb, this agonizing wait for resurrection, someone else repeats it, saying, I know that my Redeemer lives. And so we come back here this Sunday, the Sunday after Easter Monday. The Sunday after a weekend, an Easter weekend, in which 9 people were killed and at least 36 wounded in Chicago. We come back to church today and say together that despite the sin and the sickness and the illness in our families, the violence in our families and in our cities, despite all that, we come back together and say, I know that my Redeemer lives. And we say with these children up here, these proud, excited children, the week after Easter, they came back again, and And they say, Jesus Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
And we can still say it together, even despite all this pain, all this sin. And that's, I think, the key part of this Easter message. That Easter doesn't just happen and that's the thing I had to realize a little bit this year too, because I came out of a church background where we had like 6,000 people at our church for Easter. And it's always this crazy, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 6 services in the morning, and there's this crazy buzzing energy, and we've got all these great musical acts in and all this excitement. And it's like, I read this article about it, that Easter can become sort of triumphalist. And Easter can become like, hey, aren't we great? Isn't our church great? And I think I got smacked back into reality on Easter Monday when I read about the violence in Chicago, when I recalled all the pain and all the hurt right here in this congregation, and I remembered that the resurrection happens not in a triumphalist state, but the resurrection happened among people who were struggling, among people who were believing in Jesus, even though the religious establishment was against them, even though the government was against them. Yes. The resurrection happened in the midst of this pain. And in our lives today, in this city of Chicago, where too much violence happens to kids, where it's not fair, where groups from the south side and the north side don't get together enough, the resurrection still happens. And we can come together today and have our sanctuary absolutely buzzing with your music. So Easter in Chicago. And I was particularly struck by the story of Tamisha, a 5th grader, who had just hours earlier returned from church and shared an Easter dinner with relatives. She was struck by 2 bullets, one that hit her chin and one that punctured a lung and broke her collarbone. I was reading this story, which I shouldn't have been doing, but I was reading this story on my cell phone at a red light on my way. Well, I was taking Jake to daycare, so that's a picture of Jake's daycare. And I was thinking about what it might be like if I had to be worried while I was driving my son to daycare about violence happening right in front of me. See, Easter happens in Chicago amidst all of us. And the ways that this violence strikes us all differently, but we've all been touched by violence and by pain and by illness and by hurt and by injustice in our lives. And yet Easter still comes. Job today speaks to us. In the midst of his torment, he speaks to us. Not only does he cry out and lament, because there is a place for us to lament even on Easter. My God, why have you forsaken me? My God, why haven't you given me a job? My God, why are you letting my spouse's health decline so poorly? My God, why are my children so far from me? My God, when will you heal me? There is a place for lament even in the midst of Easter. And Job shows us, Job cries out, have pity on me, O you, my friends. But then Job cries us to rally. Job brings us to action and calls us out of this triumphalist, excited, hey, Easter, we're doing great, which, hey, we did have a great Easter service here. But Job pulls us out of that and into action. For I know that my Redeemer lives. Job speaks to us, and Job speaks to Chicago the day after Easter. Now I've got to bring up the cynical part here. Now, this is something that I listened to an Easter sermon from my home congregation pastor, and he said sometimes when he meets people and he tells them what he does for a living, he says, yeah, I'm a and thinking, that poor sap. And so I included a photo here of a typical Lutheran pastor, because we're easy to kind of make fun of, right? You got this Scandinavian, kind of nice little smile. Yes, everything's great. I know that my Redeemer lives. And he says he can feel people looking at him and thinking that. You poor sap. Because you actually believe that this resurrection stuff is real. And he says he encounters that all the time. And maybe you encounter that when you tell people, oh, I'm going to church this morning. And you can feel that judgment in their eyes. Why would you waste your time on that? What my pastor said when he encounters that, what he feels inside of him is he recalls all the moments he's had as a pastor, moments at the bedside of a hospital bed, of a family whose child is sick and dying. Moments at the graveside, moments with a family who's about to lose their home to foreclosure, moments in violence in his work as a chaplain. He thinks of those moments, and he remembers, and he says to them, I have to believe it,
Yes.
or I couldn't do what I do. I have to believe it, or I couldn't live.
That's right. That's right. Amen.
And how could we live in a world where on Easter evening, 9 people are killed and 36 wounded? How could we live in that world unless we believed that the resurrection was real? And that's the challenge of coming back to church the week after Easter. God challenges us, do you really believe it? Do you really believe that a man rose from the dead? And not only that, but that this promise is given to all of us.
Yes.
To those children and your children and my child and your parents and your wife and your grandchildren. Is it really real? Is the promise really real and true to you? And if it is, does it change the way that you live? We have to believe this promise begins with the promise and stretches us out to live in a way, to live lives that are changed by the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
See, the resurrection can speak easily in moments of happiness and moments of greatness. Oh, I just got a brand new job. I got a promotion. All right, Jesus lives. Christ is risen. But the most important places for the resurrection to speak are in moments of despair, moments of depression, moments of sickness, moments of violence. That is where the resurrection must speak. And so I think what God showed me this Easter morning, or this Easter Monday morning, when I felt more restless than I expected to, when I felt slapped back into reality with this news, I think what God showed me is that the work of being church begins, not ends, with the resurrection.
Yes.
And maybe all of us were a little bit tired of it. Jack and Rita were a little bit tired after putting together that whole Easter breakfast for 70-some people. But God pushes us forward. God urges us forward, saying that the Easter is not the end, but Easter is the beginning. And we all should be hungry after Easter. Not just for more Easter breakfast, but to share the good news. The resurrection only reverberates through our city. It doesn't just reverberate and happen on its own, but the resurrection reverberates through our entire city, from all the way up here to all the way down to northwest Indiana. The resurrection only reverberates because faithful people, you and me, stand up together to share the good news, to gather together and to work for peace and for justice in the name of Jesus Christ. What I want to leave you with today as we get ready to continue our worship is that Easter, see, I thought that Easter for us was going to be a victory dance. But God showed me that Easter wasn't a victory dance, and not just because I can't dance very well. But Easter is not a victory dance, but a rallying cry. Easter, like the shout of maybe during a hockey game, urges us forward. Easter is a rallying cry. And so I hope that you leave here today excited and rallied to continue to share the good news, to spread it across the city, to work wherever you feel God calling you to work, to spread the message